What is the future of Western politics? This is the central question that all channels involved in online politics are trying to answer. Of course, the answers that you will get will depend on who you ask. Some say that it is socialism, others say that it is nationalism. However, the most popular answer to this question is that the future of Western politics is and will remain liberalism. In this essay, we will look at the idea that liberalism will remain a dominant ideology in the West by taking a look at the famous or perhaps infamous essay, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. This essay is a spin-off of a project that I did with Kaiserbauch, and you can check that out here. So let's begin. Liberal democracy is the ruling ideology of the 20th and so far the 21st centuries. After the end of the Cold War, it has enjoyed 3 decades of undisputed hegemony. This dominance has led to the attempted, though often unsuccessful, democratization of most of the world. Clearly, not all the countries in the world are functioning liberal democracies, but it is the only political ideology that is seen as legitimate. So much so that even the anti-democratic dictators of the world must cloak themselves in the language and rituals of democracy. Putin must get 120% of Moscow to vote for him to appear legitimate before his own people, and let's not even mention the name of the DPRK. Kim Jong-un recognizes that a government that is for the people, by the people, is the only type of government that can appear legitimate. Therefore, we can only translate the name of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea into legitimate Korea. This is the reflection of the ideological hegemony of liberalism. If a state wants to be seen as legitimate, it must also be seen as democratic. In the same way that if we lived in a world dominated by Catholicism, all the heads of state would have to justify their power by appealing to God or the Pope himself. This hegemony of liberalism is the result of its great success in the last 150 years. Democracy defeated both fascism and communism in World War II and the Cold War respectively, while it has also produced stability, relative freedom, and great amounts of wealth and commodities for its citizens. Maybe the most famous exponent of this hegemony is Francis Fukuyama with his famous essay, The End of History. This essay, written in 1989, is where Fukuyama argues that the reform and later collapse of the Eastern Bloc represents the final victory of liberalism over all other ideologies to the point that the great ideological struggles, like the Cold War, are over, thus marking the end of history. I think that Fukuyama gets a bad reputation as the guy that predicted that the 90s represented the pinnacle of history and nothing would ever change again. However, after reading his essay and subsequent book, I have found that it is far more thoughtful than most people give it credit. He does not argue that nothing will ever change again after the 90s, nor does he claim that there will not be any more wars or conflict around the world. Instead, his thesis is that liberalism will remain the central ideology for a long time because it resolves the contradictions that drive politics better than any other system, and that this means that there are grounds for optimism about the future. So far, after 30 years, his prediction has not fallen apart, but the central question of this essay is if this will not change. It is important to remark that Fukuyama writes that it is very possible that in the future new problems and contradictions will bring about new ideologies to kickstart history once again. But in order to understand this, we first have to understand the Hegelian idea of the end of history. The core contradiction for Hegel was the tension between the master and the slave. At some point in history, one set of people conquered another and subjugated them. This obviously created tension between the slaves, who wanted to be free, and the nobles, who wanted the status and power at the expense of the slaves. For Hegel, this contradiction is the thing that drove great empires and the great social conflicts of his age. Following this logic, if there was a way to resolve this contradiction and give both sides of this conflict what they wanted, history would stop moving because history would no longer have a driving force. Indeed, Hegel proclaimed the end of history in 1806 with the triumph of Napoleon in the Battle of Jena. Napoleon represented both the democratic ideals of the French Revolution and the aristocratic interest of the European nobility in his figure as a people's emperor. The second incarnation of this idea is Marx's dialectical materialism, which replaces Hegel's contradiction of the master and the slave with the contradiction of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. According to the Marxists, this is the real driver of history, and that the end of history will be communism, a society with no more exploitation by one class or another. Finally, the third incarnation of this idea is Fukuyama's. He returns to Hegel's contradiction of master and slave, and he proposes that liberal democracy in the American, East Asian, and European models is the system that best resolves this contradiction, and as a result, they have peace and prosperity. Furthermore, this success enjoyed by the Western democracies delegitimizes the governments that are not democratic and not prosperous, such as, for example, the Soviet Union. However, we have seen many more cases of delegitimization of anti-liberal regimes, such as the Maidan Revolution or the current protests in Iran. What is interesting is that Fukuyama's main argument for liberalism is essentially utilitarian. Western democracies are richer, more stable, and happier than authoritarian states. Therefore, it is the best solution to this Hegelian contradiction. But that opens the question: what happens to the legitimacy of liberalism if liberal Western democracies are no longer rich, stable, and happy? But first, what does legitimacy mean, and how can an ideology become illegitimate? In my opinion, the legitimacy of a certain ideology is nothing more than the trust that society places on said ideology and the system that it produces. To use a previous example, liberalism is seen as legitimate because most people believe in the promises of democracy and progress. And most importantly, liberalism has so far kept its promises. That is the great reason that communism collapsed at the end of the Cold War. Scientific socialism promised a utopia to the people of the USSR. Indeed, the legitimacy of communism during the Russian Civil War and the Great Patriotic War was so great that thousands died and killed in its name. However, this evaporated because communism could not keep its promises. Instead of a classless, moneyless utopia without scarcity, they got trabants, breadlines, and Brezhnevian bureaucracy. To top this crisis of legitimacy off, there was the constant and obvious contrast between the stagnation of Eastern Europe compared to the liberal West with its prosperity, its freedom, and its rock and roll. If we can say something for certain, it is that the legitimacy of an ideology depends directly on its capacity to keep its own promises. When too many of these promises remain unfulfilled, there will be a crisis of legitimacy. So far, Western liberalism has delivered well on its promises of prosperity, individual freedom, and democracy. Western democracies are on average rich, have free elections, and the individuals in the society are free to do what they want, to live as they please. However, it is not clear that this will continue to be the case. In the eyes of Fukuyama, there are no present and imminent threats to the liberal status quo. However, as discussed on the video with Kaiserbauch, a demographic decline is inevitable in Western Europe and East Asia. This will certainly have great social and economic consequences that might threaten the promises of liberalism. No, will threaten the promises of liberalism. And yet, this tangible threat has not been taken into account by Fukuyama's analysis or by most political writers and thinkers in the West. I think that this represents a clear blind spot for Fukuyama, a clear blind spot that will shake the status quo to its core. In the countries where there will be a large demographic decline, we can also expect a large economic decline. The most extreme case of this so far is Japan, whose economy has stagnated for the past 30 years, while it has collected the largest GDP to debt ratio of any country in this world. For the moment, things in Japan remain stable, but having over 2.5 times your GDP in debt is simply not sustainable. What happens when there are fewer and fewer workers for an ever-increasing number of retirees? I mean, just look at this graph. And then imagine how it would look like in 20 years, when those in their 50s retired and the newborn generations who are not even half their size will have to take care of them. At a certain moment, the government will not be able to keep borrowing, and it will have to break its promises. Japan is perhaps the most advanced case of this, but this will also represent the future for all of Europe. The issue is that since a demographic decline has never happened due to infertility in all of history, we do not know exactly how it will look like. All that we can do is state that due to the simple arithmetic of a shrinking labor force and a shrinking population, that the future does not look too bright for Western liberal democracies. In 20 to 30 years, we could come to realistically expect that the economic stagnation of these shrinking countries could turn into a prolonged state of depression. In this state of general hardship, there would also be a large amount of social friction between a small number of overtaxed young people and a large cohort of elderly retirees who will be completely dependent on them, but will also be able to outvote the less numerous taxpayers. This is explored more deeply in Kaiser's video. This prediction will apply to differing degrees to almost every single liberal democracy, such as Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Spain, etc. The most surprising thing about this is that this problem has been obvious since the 70s, and yet instead of taking action, it was simply ignored. In each of these countries, the fundamental promises of liberalism will be broken, and thousands will become disillusioned with the status quo, which in a certain sense is already happening even without a decades-long depression. This disillusionment will cause millions to look for alternatives to liberalism, but the true question still remains unanswered. Will the demographic collapse discredit liberalism in the same way that the Brezhnev stagnation discredited communism? I think that the answer to this question depends on the only large liberal democracy that will not directly face a demographic collapse, that of course being the USA. The Americans have birth rates that are not very impressive, and in many ways they're very similar to the numbers that are coming out of Europe. However, the trump card of the Americans is that they have large amounts of migration to boost their labor force and their population. Some might say that this will also be the thing that gets Europe out of its demographic mess. However, there is one fundamental difference between European and American migration. Migrants in the US have a strong trend towards assimilation. I believe that this is because American culture is superficial, and it makes it easier for people from all around the world to become Americans and melt in the pot. The same cannot be said for European cultures that are much older and much more complex. Therefore, they are also much harder to assimilate into. For example, in Germany there are many Turkish families that have lived there for 3 generations and they still do not become assimilated. Compare this to the second generation of Mexican immigrants that can barely scrap together a sentence in Spanish. American culture is a culture that is specifically made for the assimilation of immigrants. European cultures are not made for this. The much derided superficiality of American culture might end up being a blessing. So due to migration, the US is not facing an existential demographic decline in the same way that South Korea is. This means that, at least in theory, the US will be able to keep the promises of liberalism to its population. As long as this is the case, liberalism as an ideology will not become delegitimized, even if it falls apart in the rest of the world, because its most powerful exponent will keep it alive. The failure of communism in Ethiopia did not delegitimize communism, but the fall of the USSR did. By the same token, the coming demographic decline in Japan or Italy will not delegitimize liberalism. Only the collapse of US liberalism could do such a thing. So in a strict sense, my answer to the question of will the demographic collapse delegitimize liberalism is no. But it relies on the US remaining stable and prosperous for the next couple of decades, which is by no means certain. However, I do not feel qualified to make predictions since, first of all, I'm not an American, and there are too many factors at play. So we have three scenarios. Scenario number 1. Europe and East Asia enter into a period of decline, and as a result of this hardship, many of these countries turn towards alternatives that will promise them relief. Many will turn left and proclaim that capitalism is actually the culprit of this economic hardship and will push socialism forward. Many others on the right will put nativism and nationalism as the answers to this decline. Furthermore, this will probably go hand in hand with a lot of natalism, while the left will probably prefer migration as the solution to the demographic problems, while even embracing anti-natalism in proportion to how much the right embraces natalism. What is certain is that in this first scenario, the center will be hollowed out and either the right or the left will achieve temporal political success. However, this is not something that I think will last long because nationalism and socialism by themselves cannot beat liberalism. These political movements might last a couple of decades and then they would crumble like Franco in Spain or Milosevic in Serbia. In scenario number 2, this would be very different since a new ideology arises and manages to provide a possible alternative to liberalism. As much as we deride the libs, their ideology has a lot of merit because it paints a seductive vision of the world, and in my opinion, only something that is just as robust can come to replace it. Finally, the third scenario would be a world where the USA also enters a period of prolonged hardship combined with the demographic collapse in Europe and East Asia that will lead to the total delegitimization of liberalism. In this case, there would be a period of political instability as many different ideologies will try to fill this vacuum. Whichever of these three scenarios comes to pass, what is certain is that the 2040s will be a time of great political upheaval. It will be a time of revolutions. And for those like me, who deeply dislike the status quo, it will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to bring new ideologies forth. Every right-wing writer must understand that this will be our one shot at political power, and that if the right wing continues to be made up of spineless conservatives and retarded edgelords, we will once again be defeated. It is often said that nothing ever happens, and even if I cannot say that the status quo has its days counted, I can confidently say that a lot of things will go down in the next couple of decades. What will happen, I cannot know. What I do know is that history is here and it is very much at play.